On Saturday, the 26th of April in 1986, at 1:23 a.m., an explosion rocked the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin power plant in Pripyat. A few seconds later, there was a second larger explosion, which among other things destroyed the reactor building and set the roof on fire. This incident caused massive environmental damage and bled the Soviet state dry because of the costly measures they had to take to prevent the accident from becoming even worse. Of course, we named this incident after the city which was nearby, Chernobyl. It was the greatest single nuclear accident in history, and it is the most obvious example of why nuclear power is dangerous. So it is an argument against nuclear power, made by many people. The deaths caused by the accident vary from 31 to 93,000. In this video I will explain how the reactor in Pripyat worked, how it failed, the immediate aftermath, the long-term problems, and eventually we will look at the death toll and determine how dangerous nuclear power really is, as well as why we talk about this accident so much more than the similar events which happened in Western countries. The Vladimir Lenin power plant was made up of 4 reactors, appropriately called reactors 1, 2, 3 and 4. The reactors in the plant were RBMK reactors, which translates to high power channel type reactor. The special thing about this reactor type was that it had no steel pressure vessel like other reactors. An RBMK reactor makes electricity by spinning a turbine. For that you need steam. Other power plants make steam by burning coal or oil, but in a nuclear power plant you use uranium. Uranium sends out neutrons which then hit another uranium atom and split it into other atoms. This releases heat and more neutrons, keeping the reaction going. The neutrons themselves move too quickly to actually hit an atom, so you slow them down using water and graphite. The water then heats up and it goes to drive the turbine. Of course, the water is radioactive since it comes right from the core, so you don't actually use this water for the turbine. Instead, you send it through a cooling loop. That means it cools down and heats a completely separate water loop, which then becomes steam and turns the turbine. This way, the radioactive water is in a closed loop, so it can't leave the reactor and irradiate things. The second loop gets its cooling water from the nearby pond, which is appropriately named cooling pond. And once it is steam, it's just vented into the atmosphere. The water is not only convenient for moving away the heat, but it is also useful because it slows down the speed at which the reaction is happening. If for some reason the water would turn into steam, the reactivity would go up. So it's essential that the hot water is moved to the heat exchanger before it becomes steam. In itself, the reactor would quickly turn into a nuclear bomb because every split atom releases 2 or 3 neutrons, which means exponential growth and a lot of energy being released. To make sure it won't explode, you use control rods, which slow down the reaction. In case of an emergency, there is a button called AZ5, which immediately pushes the rods into the core to shut it down. There is one more thing you need to know before we can get into the accident, and that is that one of the atoms which is produced when a uranium atom is split is xenon. And what usually happens is that this xenon is hit by a neutron and burns off. But if you don't run the reactor on full power, there may not be enough neutrons to burn off the xenon, so it would accumulate. The problem with that is that eventually the xenon can be so numerous that it chokes out the reaction by absorbing all neutrons and the reactor power drops to 0. The RBMK reactor was seen as very safe because it doesn't use high pressure vessels or enriched uranium. This means that even if there were no control rods in the reactor and no cooling water, it cannot explode. It would become really hot and it would melt and most likely melt through the flaw and contaminate the groundwater, but it could not explode no matter what, in theory. So, what happened in this early Saturday morning? Well, in the event of a power outage, the pumps which move the water would fail, which could lead to the core overheating and melting the metal, uranium and graphite into one radioactive lava-like mass called corium. So it was important that the power never cut out. They got power from the national grid as well as from the other reactors on site. Remember, we're only discussing reactor 4 today. The other 3 were running as normal. But if there is a failure in the national grid and the other 3 reactors are offline, it could be possible for the cooling pumps to stop, and that would result in a meltdown. In the event of a power loss, the reactor would be shut down as soon as possible. But of course, during the shutdown, you still need water in the core. There were diesel backup generators, but they needed a bit of time to spin up. So they needed to bridge the gap between the grid going offline and the backup generator going online. The Soviet engineers had a plan on how to do that. The idea was that the reactor would power itself. They would use the still spinning turbines to create enough power to keep the pumps running and the fuel cooled for long enough to power up the backup generators and safely shut down the reactor. A good plan in theory, but in praxis, this had never been achieved. So, on the 25th of April, they got ready to try it out. They would reduce the reactor power down to a lower level to simulate the shutdown, and then they would disconnect the cooling pumps from the national grid and use the still spinning turbine to power the pumps instead, just to prove that it's possible. This was supposed to be done by the day shift, so they were briefed on all the important parts and procedures. Those procedures, by the way, had some steps crossed out, and nobody was sure if they should do those steps or not. Fun. So they lowered the power output of the reactor, but before they could shut it down, they got a call from the grid controller. It was the end of the month, and everybody was working overtime to get their productivity quota. Keep in mind that Chernobyl is really close to Kiev, which is a major industrial city which needs a lot of power. They wouldn't be able to do the test that day. The earliest they could try it would be that night. The significance of this was that the night shift was not briefed on the test or on their tasks at all. So the operators of the nuclear power plant were not properly trained to safely operate the nuclear power plant. No red flags here. Usually the reactor ran at 3100 megawatts. That's the thermal energy in the core, not the energy the turbine produces. I am sure you know that you can never completely efficiently turn heat into electricity. They went down to 1700 megawatts in preparation for the test, but then had to hold it at that level for a few hours while waiting for the clear from the grid controller. Then the night shift took over, and at around 1 AM they were given the go-ahead for the test. Step 1 was to reduce the power to 500 megawatts. So they put control rods into the core to slowly bring the power down, and the power went to 0. Remember when I talked about xenon? At 3100 megawatts, it burns off harmlessly. But they have only been running on half of that, allowing more and more xenon to build up, which choked the reactor down to an output of 0. The fact that xenon can build up and choke the reactor was well known to the personnel, and they knew that if the core is xenon poisoned, this is very dangerous, and they need to follow a 24-hour procedure to safely get rid of the xenon and reactivate the reactor. And the story could end here, with the workers recognizing the danger and following protocol and failing to finish the test. But history has a habit of creating great tragedies from small mistakes. And one of these mistakes was the shift leader, Anatoly Dyatlov, not recognizing the danger. He thought he could still finish the test that night. And from what I've heard, he wasn't the most pleasant person out there, and he would do everything to fuck with you if you didn't listen to him. So, despite reluctancy, the workers tried their best to revive the reactor. And how do you do that? By pulling out the control rods. Thing about those control rods, they are mainly boron, but attached to them, on the bottom, there are rods made of graphite. Boron stops neutrons, graphite makes them able to fission. The logic is that when you take the boron out of the reactor, you probably want to increase the power. So the graphite is there to help you with that. But they withdrew the rods completely, including the graphite. They pulled out one rod and another and so on, and still the power won't budge. The xenon is too much. At this point, the computer relayed the urgent message that there are too few rods in the core and that they need to shut it down immediately. This fell on deaf ears. Because they were running a safety test, they ignored what the computer said. Eventually, only a couple of rods remained in the core when the power finally went up. It reached between 1 and 200 megawatts. That was too low for the test to actually be valid, but apparently Dyatlov wasn't interested in the validity of the test, just wanted to report that he had finished it. So despite really low reactor power, they started the test. Disconnect the cooling pumps from the national grid. It turns out the power coming from the slowing turbine was not enough to power the pumps. Then everything happened very quickly. The water in the channels turned into steam. This made the reaction speed up, which in turn burned off the xenon, making the reaction even more efficient. The workers saw this and immediately determined that the reactor was about to overheat and melt down, so they hit the AZ-5, scram it, shut it down. But do you remember what I said about the control rods? They had graphite below the boron, and graphite increases the speed of the reaction. And because of that, the water below the rods turned into steam, making them unable to move further into the core. What happened then, we don't exactly know. There is an explosion followed by an even larger explosion. As a result, the roof caught on fire. What we know is that the 130,000 ton reactor cover was thrown into the air and is laying on its side. And yes, those things are fuel rods filled with uranium. Contrary to what the HBO series would have you believe, the reactor was not gushing out black smoke. The roof was on fire, but the reactor fire itself was smokeless, besides steam. An eerie blue glow illuminated the night sky. This is the Chernobyl effect, which happens when neutrons go faster than the speed of light. Of course, the local speed of light, not the absolute speed of light. Nothing can be faster than the absolute speed of light. But the speed of light in the atmosphere is slower, so a neutron can go faster than that. You can think of it like a sonic boom for light. Immediately after the explosion, the government did nothing. The only official action was Anatoly Dyatlov calling the fire brigade, since the roof was still on fire. He did not warn them of radiation because he didn't think the core could have exploded. See above, RBMK reactors do not explode. But of course there was radioactive debris all over the area, most dangerously the uranium fuel rods and the graphite from the core. Both so radioactive that standing next to them gives you a lethal dose very quickly. And the firefighters were standing in between that debris. They reported tasting metal and feeling pins and needles on their face, which multiple victims of radiation poisoning confirm. Unfortunately, many of these brave men would later die from radiation poisoning, which is a slow and painful death, but more about that in the death toll section. Shortly after the explosion, the shift leader informed the head of the local executive committee. If you watched my USSR video, you know what that means. If you haven't seen it, it's basically the mayor and other representatives. The leader wasn't properly informed, because the plant workers downplayed what had happened. In part again because they thought there was no way there was an explosion. And the Geiger counters in the plant only went up to 3.6 Röntgen per hour, while the real number was 20,000 Röntgens per hour. For scale, 500 Röntgen is lethal. So they believed the risk to be far smaller than it was. The high-range dosimeter was buried under the rubble of the explosion. So they reported 3.6 Röntgen per hour to the local executive committee. If you remember my USSR video, you know that the Soviet Union was not run by individuals like a president or minister or mayor, but rather by many different committees. So when he heard about the explosion, the head of the executive committee couldn't do anything because he lacked the authority to declare an exclusion zone or to make the people stay inside or things like that. Instead, he had to call up an emergency meeting of the executive committee to discuss what to do. They decided that since the radiation was only 3.6 Röntgen per hour, that it was safe for the people to go about their daily business in the nearby city of Chernobyl. They also decided to cut the phone lines to avoid news of the accident spreading. They then informed the Minister of Energy of the Soviet Union. Curiously, they did not inform the government of Ukraine, despite the reactor being there. Then, after a few hours, the Minister of Energy called for an emergency meeting of the Executive Committee of the Soviet Union. He basically told them that there was an explosion and a fire, but the radiation levels were safe, based on what the local Executive Committee had told him. Because of this, there was a deadly delay in action of the government, since to them the urgency wasn't clear. After 2 days, they started to evacuate Pripyat. Only 10 days later did they evacuate Chernobyl itself. And that is significant, because the accident happened on the 26th of April. What comes a few days after April? May 1st, May Day. If you're not a leftist, you may not know this, but May Day is basically the greatest holiday in leftist states. It's like communist Christmas. There are parades, music, sweets, and everyone is in the streets celebrating the achievements of the USSR. But being outside and celebrating can be very dangerous if there are massive amounts of fallout raining down on you. The worst hit major city was Kiev, because it was right next to Chernobyl. Really, the celebration should not have happened. People should have stayed inside, but nobody told them about the radiation until years later. The exclusion zone was said to be 30 kilometers or 20 miles. Since then, it has been reshaped to take into account the radiation hotspots. In total, 300,000 people had to abandon their homes permanently, and they were told the evacuation would only last 3 days, so they only brought the most necessary things. All other belongings were left there and eventually plundered by looters in the following decades. Initially, the Soviet Union didn't tell anyone about the accident, but after 2 days, workers in the flaw nuclear power plant over 1,000 kilometers away in Sweden set off radiation detectors. After a brief investigation, they determined that it wasn't a leak in their reactor, but rather somewhere else. They asked the USSR if they had an accident, and they said no. So the Swedes said they would file an alert with the International Atomic Energy Agency, at which the Soviets admitted that yes, they had a broken reactor. The Soviet government had a 20-second broadcast essentially saying there was an explosion, but it's fine now. After a few days, it became apparent that it was not okay, and eventually workers used a better dosimeter, and they realized, to their horror, that the radiation levels were the opposite of safe. On top of that, the reactor fire was releasing more radiation into the atmosphere every second, so priority number 1 was to extinguish the fire. Unfortunately, nuclear fuel is so hot that it cannot be extinguished with water, which the firefighters, who were the first responders, quickly noticed. Instead, they decided to drop sand, clay, and boron on the core. Only one problem. If you were in a line of sight with the exposed core, you would die within a few days. Which means this image of the mangled reactor killed someone. Remember, 20,000 Röntgen. So they decided to drop the material by helicopter, hoping that the wind would carry it into the reactor. Approximately 5,000 tons of material were dropped over the core. Personally, I would have taken a large material handling elevator and put it over the reactor, so there's less chance of missing, but I am sure there is some very smart reason why they didn't do the way easier solution and use half of the Soviet helicopter fleet. Many years later, when the radiation died down, some people went into the core, and what they found was no sand, no boron, no lead, and no clay. So apparently the wind failed to carry it there. But despite there being no trace of the 5,000 tons of material, the fire died down after 2 weeks. It's estimated that most of the graphite burned away by that time, so the fire was out of fuel, since boron and uranium do not burn. The material they dropped along with the graphite, boron and uranium, which were part of the reactor construction, melted into a uniform mass called corium. And that mass was very hot, about 12,000 degrees, because uranium around other uranium creates heat. So there was this intensely radioactive lava slowly burning through the floor and adding molten concrete to itself, which was a major problem because under the reactor there is a water reservoir for the emergency cooling pumps. What happens when 12,000 degrees hot corium meets water? a steam explosion, which would put a lot of radioactive material into the environment. So it was necessary to drain the tanks. 3 volunteers went into the flooded part of the basement and opened the sluice valve, successfully averting the risk of an explosion. They were given the Order for Courage by the Ukrainian government in 2018. I just mentioned that the basement was flooded, and you may wonder if that would cause an explosion. And the answer is yes, it would. So they had fire engines pump out the water. After the basement was dry, there was only one more risk left. The nuclear lava might get into the groundwater. So they decided to build a heat exchanger to freeze the ground below the reactor to stop it from moving further. For this they employed coal miners. Luckily, after passing through 3 stories, the nuclear mass stopped melting the concrete and it came to rest all over the basement, coming through any opening, most famously in the form of the so-called elephant's foot, which was so radioactive that it would kill you if you stood next to it for under a minute. After the immediate response, we must come to the long-term solutions. They now knew that the reactor would not explode a second time, but that doesn't mean that it was safe by any measure. So first, radioactive debris. They estimated they had to move 100 tons of material before they could build a structure to contain the core. Because of the direction of the explosion, almost all debris was on the 3 different roofs next to the exposed core. The Soviets did the obvious thing, and instead of sending humans into the second most radioactive place in existence, they used robots. In total, 60 robots were used to slowly push the debris back into the core. But it turns out sensitive electronics and thousands of Röntgen don't go well together, so most of the robots broke down. They only managed to clear 10% of the material, which is 10 tons. Sounds a lot more impressive that way. So the task was given to liquidators, which is the job title for those who helped with the cleanup around Chernobyl. They would have to remove the debris by hand, all 90 tons of it, made even harder by the fact that on one of the roofs you would get a lifetime radiation dose in 40 seconds, which means that is the maximum dose you can receive in your working life without it impacting your life expectancy. Above that, your DNA is so damaged that you will get cancer in the future. Of course, every liquidator was only supposed to do the task once, but some reported having done it 5 or 6 times, which is very bad for their health. 24 days after the explosion, all the most dangerous debris had been put back into the core, and they started constructing a huge concrete containment building nicknamed the sarcophagus. A German documentary called it the last great building projects of socialism. They did what they could to protect the workers, like having crane operators work in lead-lined cabins and constructing a radiation shield for reactor number 3, which, by the way, was still operating. All other 3 reactors in the facility kept operating until the year 2000, right in the exclusion zone. They had to power Kiev after all. The construction of the sarcophagus took 6 months. They put up 3 concrete walls, the reactor building being the 4th wall, and they put a very light ceiling on top. It had to be very light, as to not to collapse under its own weight when they used a crane to place it there. Remember, nobody can go above the core, so building a typical roof wouldn't have worked. They also created a ventilation system that would filter radioactive particles. While the construction workers built the sarcophagus, liquidators began the cleanup for the contaminated area. There was a debate whether they should even do that, because after a year, most of the radioactive isotopes would have decayed already. But the Soviet Union decided that the land was important enough to clean up early, in part because they wanted to show that they were taking care of the people. Many tons of topsoil were buried under themselves. All streets and buildings were cleaned, all animals in the exclusion zone were killed because it was feared that they would carry the contamination to more places. They used a special cleaning fluid called borda to clean the cities. It would absorb nuclear particles, and once it dried, it could be peeled off the buildings and buried. The vehicles the liquidators used were too irradiated to be used from then on, so they were all abandoned in a field. And then looters took the highly irradiated parts to sell them to people who didn't know where they came from. Yay. By the year 2000, the containment building was beginning to fall apart, so they took measures to stabilize it. At this point, there were still 10,000 Röntgen per hour recorded in the core. The international community came up with a 2.1 billion euro plan to build a new containment building around the old containment building, dubbed the New Safe Confinement. It was constructed next to the building and then moved over it in 2017. It is designed to last at least 100 years, so for our intents and purposes, we don't need to worry about it in our lifetimes, unless they invent immortality. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev would many decades later say that the collapse of the USSR was in large part accelerated by the accident in Chernobyl. It cost the state a lot of money and effort, and the slow response time gave the state a reputation of being slow, overly bureaucratic, and incapable of ruling correctly, which fed into the anti-Soviet sentiment that would eventually cause the Union to collapse. I didn't mention Chernobyl in my video on the collapse of the USSR, but I should have, because it is in large part the start of people openly questioning the actions of the state, and that combined with Gorbachev's policies that opened up political discourse caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, let's come to the death toll. The estimates vary wildly from 31 to 93,000. In the immediate aftermath, 237 people suffered from acute radiation sickness, of which 29 died, in addition to 2 plant workers who died in the explosion, making 31. So that's the low end. It's mostly workers in the power plant and firefighters that put out the fire on the roof, as well as 2 unlucky fishermen who were fishing in the cooling pond of the nuclear power plant at 1:30 a.m. on a Saturday. Okay, there was also a girl who bicycled towards the burning nuclear reactor to watch the fire. She got radiation poisoning but survived. In the years afterward, 15 people have died from thyroid cancer, believed to have been caused by the accident. About 5 million people still live in the contaminated areas, though not the highly contaminated ones. Those places are still off limits. It is estimated that about 4,000 people in these areas will die as a result of the contamination, which is 1 in 1,250. Out of the 66,000 emergency workers from Belarus, only 150 died by the mid-90s, so 10 years later. In Ukraine, which provided hundreds of thousands of emergency workers, a total of 5,722 had died by the year 2000. 5% of the population of Ukraine claimed to have suffered as a result of the accident. But this is likely not accurate, because claiming to have suffered gets you financial compensation. The area most affected is right on the border between Ukraine and Belarus. But radiation spread further than that. Estimates vary wildly. A 2006 study concluded that 5,000 people would die from the late effects of the radiation, and that by 2065, that number may climb to over 4,000. There are anti-nuclear advocacy groups who came up with their own totals in non-peer-reviewed articles. They eventually came to a total of 93,000 excess deaths. This is how they reach that. They take the global amounts of cancer before the accident, and then the total amount of cancer cases nowadays, and say the increase of cancer was 100% because of Chernobyl. The fact that the global population increased by 50% and that we have way better screening for cancer nowadays doesn't have anything to do with the increase at all. Naturally, nobody takes that seriously. But they still call this the upper estimate, which isn't great for the truth. At this point, I would like to mention the HBO series again, because they are way overblowing the danger of some of the things. For example, they said that if the water tank had exploded, that all of Belarus and Ukraine would be uninhabitable, and the millions would die, which isn't accurate. And when Legasov says that the reactor will keep burning until the entire continent is dead, that is a lie as well. He should be perfectly aware that the core will run out of graphite long before the radiation would reach dangerous levels over any long distance. Worst case, with the hydrogen explosion, maybe the restricted zone would be 60 kilometers instead of 30. And maybe the absolute worst case radiation would get into the Dnieper River, but it would be so diluted by all the water that it probably still would not be dangerous. Kiev is only 100 kilometers from Chernobyl, but I don't estimate that it was under any legitimate threat from the radiation in any way more than what had happened in reality. So, is nuclear power as dangerous as the show suggests? No. Yes, people died from the accident, but if you look at the efficiency of nuclear power, you see that a lot of megawatts per hour per death. Coal power plants are 11,000 times more dangerous than nuclear power. And even wind energy, which is the second safest option, is almost twice as dangerous as nuclear power. So yes, radiation is terrifying because you cannot see it. And radiation poisoning is a very unpleasant death. But so is lung cancer. And the thing is, coal, oil and gas power plants just throw their toxic waste into the atmosphere, where nuclear energy doesn't release any radioactivity unless there is a serious accident. In the Netherlands, they have an oranje doos, which translates to orange box, and it stores 100% of Dutch nuclear waste since 1982, and is predicted to have enough capacity for 100 years. The nuclear waste is a lot more dangerous in theory than in praxis. Keep it in a sealed container and there is no danger. You can't say the same for CO2. So let us come to the final question. Why are we talking about this? You could say that about anything, really, like why talk about the Leber theory of value or about the bad PragerU video, but I would like to argue that it's because it is interesting and we can learn new things from talking about the past. But specifically for Chernobyl, there are extra reasons to talk about it. For example, it's a fascinating story and there was recently an HBO series made about it, so it's topical. But still, American nuclear tests killed and irradiated more people than Chernobyl did. But there is no mini-series on the natives of the Bikini Atoll and how they mysteriously all got cancer following American nuclear tests on the neighboring island. And we don't talk about British and French nukes the same we talk about North Korean nukes. I would like to argue that this is a bias in the media. When our country is bad, then it's justified, and it doesn't have to be discussed. But when the exact same thing happens to an enemy country, now that needs to be brought to the attention of everyone. I'm not saying there is some secret government conspiring to make Chernobyl seem worse than it was, using biased reporting. I think reporters have a subconscious desire to fight for their tribe by talking badly about the other tribe, not to mention the financial incentive. People love stories that make them part of the good group, and people don't like hearing their country criticized. That's why when you mention systemic racism, conservatives cover their ear and loudly sing the anthem to drown you out, even if you have plenty of studies showing that the US is in fact not a perfect country, but rather a decent idea with many flaws. Of course, the Cold War is over and Russia is not the big bad enemy it used to be. There are still the others, but less so. I can't say the same for North Korea, which nobody likes. China is seen as a monumental other by some people, but most are still trading with China, so it's nowhere near as bad as it was with the USSR. So in conclusion, the power plant in Chernobyl appeared to be indestructible, which caused the people who run it to not immediately realize the scope of what had happened. Because of the decentralized nature of the governing committees, the responses were very slow. That's the downside of democracy. A dictator can make choices a lot quicker than you can meet with an executive committee and discuss which actions to take. You may have noticed that there are ads on my videos now, even though I turned ads off. This is because YouTube now puts ads on demonetized videos. So the only difference between those and monetized videos is that I don't see any of the money. So I am officially turning on ads again. Sorry for everyone who became a Patreon because I didn't do ads. Feel free to unpledge. I would like to thank Comrade Asshole, There Is the Bird, Eric Betts, VCTR7, Attila Nemetz, Bryn Flaws, Carissa, German Pineapple, Daniel Hyman, Daphne, Dr. Grimm, Emily Marigold Klasse, Gabby Gita Herdington Gerdington, Josh C, Joshua Clark, Clastrup, Masita Rojek, Nana Epema, Neil Benderi, Ollie, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Roman Briat, Sean Murphy, Staymaster Chef, Stephen and Trey.